The lecture had never failed him. Quarrix-Seven knew this, the way a musician knows a piece they have played 10,000 times, not by thinking about it, but by the particular quality of ease that settled into his limbs when he stood at the front of the xenobiology amphitheater and felt 47 pairs of eyes orient toward him. The room smelled of recycled atmosphere and nervous first-years, which was the same smell it had carried for 31 cycles, and he found it, privately, one of the more reassuring smells in his life. He shifted to 2 legs. The class stilled. "Civilizational ceiling," he said, the way another professor might say good morning. Why apex gravity worlds produce no spacefaring species. He did not look at his notes. He had not looked at his notes since the 14th time he delivered this lecture, when he had understood that the notes were no longer a record of what he knew but a crutch he no longer required. The argument lived in him now. The 400 fossil records, the statistical modeling, the elegant mathematics of metabolic overhead versus neural complexity. He could feel the shape of it, the way you feel the shape of a room in the dark. He knew exactly where every doorway was. He began with the fossil record, as he always did. The thresh of Kavai Allen IV, apex predators of a 1.4 G world, whose bones showed dense musculature and short, powerful limbs scaled precisely for the gravity that shaped them, extinct before they reached anything resembling city building. The Gorath colonies on Pelion Thur, slightly lighter gravity, slightly further along. They had achieved tool use before the climate shifted and the record went quiet. 40 species, 40 variations on the same story. High gravity produced strength. Strength produced predators. Predators produced dead ends. His secondary arms were still. He was, in the private language of his own body, completely composed. He was a craftsman presenting his best work. The metabolic mathematics, he said, are not complicated. They are simply expensive. He moved through the equations with the particular pleasure of someone who has internalized a proof so completely it feels like a natural law. Maintaining a high-gravity body burns resources. Those resources cannot simultaneously fuel the neural development, social complexity, and technological accumulation required for spaceflight. The universe does not offer exceptions. The fossil record, 400 worlds deep, had never shown him one. He had spent 3 decades looking. In the 3rd row, a hand went up. Quarrix-Seven registered it with the peripheral attention he gave to most interruptions. Patient, slightly measured. A first year. Human, which was unusual. He had noted the exchange student's enrollment form last week with mild interest and filed it. The boy had been quiet since the lecture began, which suggested either that he was paying attention or that he was overwhelmed by the scale of the material. And Quarrix-Seven had not yet formed an opinion on which. He had brown skin, dark eyes, and the look of someone taking extremely careful notes. He had, in fact, been drawing something in the margin of his notes for the last several minutes, which Quarrix-Seven noted as either spatial thinking or inattention, and had not yet resolved. "Yes," Quarrix-Seven said, "I'm sorry to interrupt." The boy's galactic standard was careful. Slightly accented, he spoke the way someone speaks a language they learned from recordings rather than immersion. Precise and slightly formal. "I think I might be misreading the dataset. I just want to check." "Check," Quarrix-Seven said. "The threshold is 0.9 standard gravity. That's what your slide shows. Correct. Earth's surface gravity is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared." A pause, which is approximately 1 G standard. The sentence landed in the room like a stone in still water. Quarrix-Seven's secondary arms moved. He did not notice them move. They began their small, compulsive adjustments. The thing his students called thinker hands, the tell he had never successfully suppressed in 89 years of trying. His left eye dilated a fraction of a second before his right, and he was aware of this, and he found it, in this particular moment, catastrophically poorly timed. He did the arithmetic. The room was very quiet. He was aware, in a distant, professional part of his mind, that 46 other species were also doing the arithmetic, could feel it, somehow, the way you feel a current shift in water. He was aware that their eyes were moving between him and the human boy with the careful note-taking and the diagram in the margin. He was aware that the human boy had the look of someone who had stepped on something and was not yet certain whether it was significant. The arithmetic was not complicated. That was the problem. 9.8 meters per second squared. Standard gravity, by the Galactic Academy's own measurement system, was 9.7, the threshold in his lecture. The threshold he had placed at 0.9 standard, the threshold beneath which civilizational development remained possible, above which it did not, sat at approximately 9.3 meters per second squared. Humans were from a world at 9.8. Humans were in this room. Quarrix-Seven's mouth went still. It was not the stillness of composure. It was the expression of a person pressing down very hard on something large. His students found this expression frightening. The boy in the third row watching him would later describe it as looking sad, which was not the word Quarrix-Seven would have chosen, but was not, perhaps, entirely wrong. He stood at the front of the room for 4 seconds. He counted them, and then he said, in a voice that was precise and steady and gave nothing away, "Class is dismissed. Tomás Reyes, please remain." The students filed out. The silence they left was different from their quiet. That had been the held breath of an audience, and this was the exhaled aftermath of something no one had expected. A few of them glanced back at the door. One Kralvet student, sitting 2 seats from Tomás, did not look at the door. She looked at the human with an expression of focused, unhesitating interest, leaning forward, the way a scientist leans toward a specimen that has done something unexpected. Then she stood and nodded to him once and left. When the door closed, Quarrix-Seven dropped to 4 legs. He did not intend to. He simply found himself there, 4-legged, which was his thinking posture, which meant his body had made a decision without consulting him. He was aware this was undignified. He did not stand up. "Walk me through it," he said. The boy blinked. He had been, Quarrix-Seven suspected, braced for something else. Anger, perhaps, or the particular cold formality some professors used as armor. The invitation to simply proceed clearly required a recalibration. He watched Tomás recalibrate. The boy was quick about it. "Earth's gravitational constant is 9.8 meters per second squared," Tomás said, slowly and precisely, the way he might walk across unfamiliar terrain. "You've been using 0.9 G standard as the upper threshold for civilizational development, but G standard is 9.7 meters per second squared, which puts Earth at approximately 1.01 standard. We're above the threshold by about 0.11 G. By your own data set," Quarrix-Seven said. "By the Academy's own measurement standard," Tomás said, and there was something careful in how he said it. Not corrective, not triumphant. Just precise. Just making the thing true. Quarrix-Seven was quiet for a moment. His breathing had changed, deepened, slowed, become the particular deliberate rhythm his colleagues recognized as the sign of something significant developing in his head. He was aware of Tomás noticing the change and filing it without commenting on it. The boy was, he thought, an unusual observer. "How old are you?" he asked. 19. "You have been on campus for how long?" 3 weeks. "And you identified this discrepancy 40 minutes into your first xenobiology lecture." He was not asking a question. Yes. I noticed it during the statistical summary section. I almost didn't say anything." A pause. "I probably should have waited until after class." "No," Quarrix-Seven said. "You should have done precisely what you did." He stood up, 2 legs, address posture, though there was no one to address except the boy sitting in the 3rd row with his notebook open. "Come to my office." The office of the Chair of Evolutionary Civilizational Studies occupied a corner of the xenobiology building that received light from 2 directions, which Quarrix-Seven had arranged specifically and which his colleagues found excessive. The walls held shelves of physical specimens, hard-copy research volumes, and, somewhat eccentrically, a geological map of every high-gravity world in his data set. color-coded by the depth of the fossil record. He had made the map himself. It was large. It was slightly crooked. He had never fixed it. He pulled a notebook from the third desk drawer. Physical, bound, obviously old, its cover worn soft from decades of handling. Tomás, standing in the doorway, looked at it with an expression that Quarrix-Seven could not immediately categorize. Not skepticism. Something warmer than that. Quarrix-Seven opened to a blank page. He wrote at the top, in his own hand, "Human anomaly. Working notes." "Sit," he said. "I have questions. They were there for 3 hours." Quarrix-Seven asked about Earth's evolutionary record, about the specific pressures that high gravity had placed on human anatomy and how the lineage had resolved them, the bipedal posture, the arched foot, the extraordinary capacity of the knee joint to absorb repeated impact, the cardiovascular system's adaptation to continuous metabolic load. He asked about the relationship between human brain development and the physical constraints that had shaped it. He asked about tool use, about social structure, about the particular evolutionary pressures that had driven cooperation rather than the arms race scaling his model predicted. Tomás answered what he could. When he could not answer, he said so. Not with apology, not with embarrassment, but with the flat, clean delivery of someone making a factual statement. "I don't know," in his mouth sounded like a complete thought, finished and at rest, requiring no decoration. Quarrix-Seven had not heard this particular quality in a student in a very long time. He found he could not stop noticing it. At some point during the third hour, Tomás said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why a physical notebook?" Quarrix-Seven looked at the notebook. "Because," he said after a moment, "I do not fully trust the permanence of the things I write on screens. A screen can be revised without trace. A notebook requires me to cross things out." Tomás was quiet for a moment. "Then, that's why I draw diagrams instead of sentences. Sentences can say the wrong thing too easily. A diagram has to be right or it doesn't work." Quarrix-Seven looked at the boy for a long moment. His secondary arms made a small, settling motion, not the agitated movement of processing difficulty, something slower. He thought, though he could not have said why, of a very long journey arriving at a place with good weather. He said, with the particular precision he reserved for things he meant, "You are going to be a very good scientist." Tomás looked at his notebook. He did not say "thank you," which Quarrix-Seven found correct. He just nodded once and kept looking at his notes. The trouble started the following morning. Ravakos found Tomás in the corridor between the first and second morning sessions, moving with the directness characteristic of Kralvith who have decided something needs to be said. Tomás had spent the night in a state of exhausted relief. The conversation with Quarrix-Seven had been, unexpectedly, one of the best intellectual experiences of his 3 weeks on campus, and he had gone to sleep at an almost reasonable hour and had not, for once, spent 2 hours staring at the ceiling feeling the weight of being very far from home. Ravakos told him what was happening. Tomás stood in the corridor and let it settle. A senior faculty member named Yolande Doss had, apparently, wasted no time. The Sulian professor had spent 30 years accumulating her own grievances with Quarrix-Seven's departmental dominance, and she had identified the incident as the kind of structural opening that only presents itself once. By the time Tomás had been sitting in Quarrix-Seven's office asking about bipedal posture, Yolande Doss had already sent 3 private communiques to fellow faculty members, 2 to the Dean's Administrative Office, and 1 to the Academy-wide Academic Integrity Board, citing, with accurate specificity, because she was nothing if not precise, the error in Quarrix-Seven's published lecture data. She was not wrong. That was the problem. She was not wrong about the error, and she was not wrong that it constituted a significant academic oversight. She was using that correctness as a weapon, which was a different thing, but from the outside the two looked identical. Beyond the faculty politics, the incident had propagated through student networks overnight. Some students were arguing that it demonstrated exactly why human admission to the academy remained controversial. Others were arguing the opposite. His name was being used by both groups. neither of whom had spoken to him, neither of whom had, he suspected, thought about what it might be like to have your name in an argument you had not started and did not want to be in. Revakos watched him absorb all of this with the focused stillness that was her species' equivalent of concern. Then she said, with directness, "You did the right thing." Tomas's mouth did something complicated. He said quietly, "I just wanted to check the number." "I know," she said. "You still did the right thing. Don't apologize." He went to his afternoon sessions. He kept his head down and took notes and drew diagrams in the margins. One of the diagrams was not spatial thinking. It was, if you looked closely, the outline of a house, and then a city, and it might have been Guadalajara, or it might have been nothing. And he closed the notebook before anyone could see. That night he called his mother. He told her about the lecture, the factual version, the version that did not include the word politics or the word terrified. She said she was proud of him. She asked if he was eating. He said yes, which was approximately true. He did not tell her about Yolandoas. He did not tell her about the campus argument. He said he had met a professor who kept a physical notebook, which was a true thing and a safe thing, and somehow easier to say than the rest of it. After he hung up, he made coffee. His roommate, a Volthari named something he could not quite render in the standard phonetic set, who had been patient and entirely uncomplaining about the smell for 3 weeks, opened the window, not with exasperation, just opened it, the small mechanical gesture of someone making a minor adjustment to accommodate a minor reality. The night air came in, complex and alien, carrying whatever scents this planet carried that were not coffee. Tomás sat with the coffee and the window and the night, and felt, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, something stubborn and quiet that he could not quite name. He had not been wrong to say it. The number had been wrong, and he had said so. He had not been wrong. He finished the coffee. He went to sleep. He was not asleep when Quarrix-Seven on the other side of campus stepped onto the observation deck and found that he was not alone. This had not been planned. Quarrix-Seven had come to the deck for the same reason he had always come to it in difficult periods. It looked down on the main research complex, all lit windows and distant movement, and the sight of people working reminded him, usually, of why the work mattered. Tonight the reminder felt necessary in a way it had not felt in years. He noticed Tomás a moment before Tomás noticed him. The boy was standing at the far railing, looking at the same view, with the posture of someone who had also needed to go somewhere high and quiet, and not particularly think. They stood at the railing together for a while without speaking. The research complex hummed below them. Eventually, Quarrix-Seven said, not looking at the boy, "What is it like?" Tomás turned. "To come from somewhere the galaxy did not expect," Quarrix-Seven said. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a question that deserved consideration, and Tomás was giving it that consideration, which Quarrix-Seven had already learned to recognize and respect. Then the boy said slowly, "It's like being a proof that no one wanted to find." He paused. "You exist, so the theorem was wrong, but no one's sure yet whether to rewrite the theorem or argue about the proof." The pale geometric marking on Quarrix-Seven's back, the pale pattern that indicated scholarly lineage, that flushed dark under strong emotion, that he could not see and did not know about, went dark. He felt heat move through him and did not know its source. He said, "I wrote the theorem." "I know," Tomás said. Then, after a moment, "I don't blame you." The data wasn't there yet. The research complex hummed. Somewhere below them, a light in a window went out and another came on. Quarrix-Seven had spent 89 years moving through a galaxy he understood. He had theories about the universe that had held for 31 years, and that the universe had apparently been quietly, patiently waiting to correct. He had believed, without entirely examining the belief, that the hierarchy of civilizations in the known galaxy reflected something genuine, not superiority of worth. He was not crude enough for that, but superiority of circumstance, the idea that what the universe had produced at the apex it had shaped for the apex. and that this shaping could be read in bone records and gravitational constants. And here was a 19-year-old from somewhere called Guadalajara, standing at a railing in the dark, telling him the data wasn't there yet, with the particular absence of resentment that was either very young or very evolved, and Quarrix-Seven was not entirely sure which. He said, "What will you study here, specifically? What question do you want to answer?" Tomás thought about it. "Why intelligence emerges when it does," he said. "What conditions are necessary and which ones we just assumed were necessary, because they were true for most of the species we found first." A pause. "I think the sample was biased." Quarrix-Seven's breathing deepened and slowed. "Yes," he said after a long moment, "I think it may have been." The faculty assembly convened 2 days later. Yolande Doss had spent those days building carefully. She was a skilled politician as well as a skilled scientist, and she understood that the moment required more than a simple challenge to Quarrix-Seven's dataset. She had framed it as a systemic failure, a tenured professor's unchecked authority over a field, the absence of peer review for departmental lectures, the question of whether academic reputation had insulated a significant error from the scrutiny it deserved. She was not wrong about any of this either. That was, from Quarrix-Seven's perspective, the part worth acknowledging. She finished her statement with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it. The assembly hall was full. Quarrix-Seven sat in the second row, in the position of the person being reviewed, which was a position he had occupied as a junior researcher 6 decades ago, and had not occupied since. He waited until she was fully done. Then he stood. "My data set was incomplete," he said, in the voice he used for lectures. Steady, precise, the voice that had filled the xenobiology amphitheater for 31 years. "My conclusion was wrong. The student who identified the error in my dataset, Tomás Reyes, first-year exchange, xenobiology, identified it correctly, reported it with scientific rigor, and should receive a formal academic commendation." He sat down. The silence was not the silence of the lecture hall that had been shock, raw and unprocessed. 47 species doing arithmetic. This was a different kind of silence. It was a silence of people recalibrating, rearranging the shapes of what they had assumed this assembly would produce, finding that the shape no longer fit the space they had made for it. Yolande Doss sat very still. She was intelligent enough to understand immediately what had happened. The acknowledgement was clean. It was precise. It had arrived before she could attach her political structure to it, and it had removed the foundation she needed. She could not challenge an error that had already been acknowledged. She could not argue for accountability from someone who had, in front of the full assembly, simply held himself accountable. Quarrix-Seven watched this understanding move through her, and felt something that was not quite sympathy and not quite satisfaction, something that sat between them. He had not done this to defeat her. He had done it because it was what the truth required, and the two things had turned out to be the same. Dean Farrick-Sewell, a Darine of 140 years, whose fur had gone pale amber, and who had the look of a man who had spent the last 2 days imagining a significantly more complicated version of this meeting, approved the commendation before the assembly was half over, with a speed that suggested the gratitude of someone who had just been spared an extremely difficult afternoon. The commendation ceremony was small. A function room off the administrative corridor, good light, 20 or 30 people, mostly staff, and a handful of students. Tomás stood at the front and looked at his shoes. Quarrix-Seven stood in the back of the room. He watched the commendation read aloud. Scientific rigor, contribution to academic discourse, the first formal commendation awarded to a human exchange student in the history of Verith campus. The words were correct, but they were, he thought, also insufficient. They described what had happened without touching why it mattered. They did not mention the particular quality of the question, which was not aggressive or triumphant, which was just a student checking a number because the number seemed wrong, and wrong numbers, to him, were apparently physically intolerable. The commendation did not know how to honor that. Commendations did not have the vocabulary. Tomás looked up once, briefly, scanning the room. He found Quarrix-Seven. Quarrix-Seven gave him a single nod. Not warm, not dramatic. The precise acknowledgement of one rigorous mind toward another. The nod a craftsman gives to a colleague who has done the thing correctly. Tomás looked at his shoes. His jaw moved, once, in a way that meant he was working on something internally with the same focused effort he brought to everything else. He was, Quarrix-Seven noted with a clarity that surprised him, trying not to cry. The trying was visible in the set of his shoulders, in the deliberate attention to his shoes, in the careful way he was holding his face. It was an act of considerable discipline, applied to an entirely ordinary human emotion, and it was somehow the most dignified thing Quarrix-Seven had witnessed in years. He thought, standing in the back of the room. In 31 years of teaching, I have watched students receive commendations for excellent work. I have watched them accept them with pride, with relief, with performance. I have never watched one accept it like this, as a weight, as something that cost something, as the residue of a few days that required more courage than the commendation would ever know how to say. He went back to his office that night. The notebook was open on the desk. He had been adding to the human anomaly notes for 3 days, pages of them, questions generating other questions, the particular generative chaos of a problem he had not solved. He set the notebook aside and opened a new document on his terminal. The blank page looked back at him. He typed, "Civilizational Ceiling, a Working Theory." He was there for 4 hours. The new lecture was longer. He kept what was right, the fossil record, the metabolic mathematics, the 40 species that had played the high-gravity scenario to its predicted conclusion. He kept the elegance of the argument in the places where the argument remained elegant. He did not gut it. He was not that kind of wrong. He was the specific kind of wrong that happens when a correct framework is applied to an incomplete dataset, and the correction required not demolition, but revision. He was, in a way he had not expected, grateful for this. Demolition would have been easier. Revision required him to know exactly which pieces to keep, and knowing that required him to understand his own work more precisely than 31 years of certainty had required. He added a section on the human record, not just the gravitational anomaly, but the specific evolutionary pressures that had produced it. High gravity plus exceptional social complexity, plus a prolonged developmental period, plus opposable thumbs, plus, apparently, the particular psychological trait that made them incapable of leaving wrong numbers uncorrected. He wrote, "The human case does not disprove the metabolic model. It extends it. The question is not whether high gravity precludes spacefaring civilization. The question is whether any sufficiently improbable combination of factors can produce an outcome that circumvents otherwise reliable constraints." He paused. His secondary arms made their small, settling movement. He typed, "The honest answer is that we do not know. We have one example. One is not a trend. One is a door." He wrote the closing section last. He sat for a long time before writing it, in the particular stillness that meant he was close to something he had not yet reached. His secondary arms were still. His breathing was slow. He thought about Tomás on the observation deck, saying, "I don't blame you." The data wasn't there yet. He thought about what it would take for a person who has every reason to be resentful, to say that with that particular cleanness, not as forgiveness exactly, but as the flat statement of a truth. The data wasn't there. It is there now. Let's proceed. He thought about what kind of person arrives at 19 with that quality of mind, that specific combination of precision and generosity, the ability to look at a theorem written partly about them and say, yes, but the data wasn't there yet. He thought, I have spent 31 years trying to give students the right answers. He thought, I have never once considered that the right answer might be a student who asks the right question. He typed the new introduction's final line. He read it back once. Everything in this room is provisional, especially this. He closed the document. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the office, his back to the geological map with its slightly crooked frame, surrounded by specimens and 31 years of careful work that had turned out to be like almost everything in a long career, both significantly right and incompletely wrong. He thought this was, perhaps, the condition of all knowledge. He thought he had known this, theoretically, for decades and had somehow managed to exempt his own lecture from the general rule. He decided this was a thing that would not happen again. Several weeks later, Quarrix-Seven stood at the front of the xenobiology amphitheater and addressed a new cohort. Different faces, 49 species this cycle, he had noted, 2 more than last time. The room smelled of recycled atmosphere and nervous first years, which was the same smell it always carried and which he now found complicated in a way it had not been before. He shifted to 2 legs. The class stilled. He delivered the lecture. The fossil record, the metabolic mathematics, the 40 species and their predicted endings. He kept the elegance of it. He kept the rigor. He moved through the statistical summary with the same precision he had always brought, but the conclusions landed differently now, not as doors closing, but as the current best answer to a question that remained open. He reached the section that used to end with the theorem. He paused. The class was very quiet. It was the quiet of people who had been told this pause was coming, who had heard something about the lecture having changed, and who were waiting to see what it had changed into. He said, "There is a human exchange student on this campus, Tomás Reyes, first year xenobiology." He let this sit for a moment. "If you have not introduced yourself to him, I recommend it. He will not explain the anomaly for you." He looked at the room, at the 49 faces, the multiple pairs of eyes, the variety of nervous first-year postures that were, across all species, more similar than different. But he will, if you ask, tell you what it is like to be one. The silence in the room was good silence. The silence of 49 minds that had just been given something to think about. He thought of Tomás's hand going up in the 3rd row, with the particular hesitation of someone not sure if they were allowed to interrupt. He thought of the question delivered with the flatness of simple fact-checking. The number was wrong, and so the number had to be corrected. Nothing more complicated than that, nothing more triumphant. He thought of the observation deck and the research complex lit below them, and the boy's voice saying the data wasn't there yet, clean and easy, making room in the theorem for the truth. He thought one honest question asked in the right room is worth 30 years of certainty. He looked at the new cohort. He said, "Everything in this room is provisional, especially this." He let them write that down.